سيدي يا محمد قلبي المحيي لما صلى عليك وسلم ذاق السعادة مغرما يا سيدي يا محمد قلبي المحيي كلما
جاكسون 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 تس
مغرما يا سيدي يا محمد قلبي المتيم وكلما صلى عليك وسلم ذاق السعادة مغرما يا سيدي يا محمد يا سيدي يا محمد قمر أطل على البارية من حراء سان السماء فكان بدرا نيرا قمر أطل على البارية من حراء سان السماء فكان بدرا نيرا هو رحمة الرحمن ذاك محمد من جاء غيثا للقلوب مطهرا يا نبي السلام عليك فاض دمع القلب وطال الشوق إليك يا نبي يا نبي صلاة الله وسلام الله دم عليك يا نبي يا نبي يا نبي يا نبي صلاة الله وسلام الله دم عليك والهداية والسلام حال الحقيقة قد محى كل الضلال نيم المحبة والهداية والسلام حال الحقيقة قد محى كل الضلال والنيل محمود حوى كبر الخصال والدار تعين الهدى والأحباب يا نبي السلام عليك فاض دمع القلب وطال الشوق إليك يا نبي يا نبي صلاة الله سلام الله دم عليك يا نبي يا نبي السلام عليك وضاع دمع القلب وطال الشوق إليك يا نبي يا نبي صلاة الله وسلام الله عليك يا نبي يا نبي يا نبي يا نبي صلاة الله وسلام الله عليك صلاة الله وسلام الله دوما عليك.
اصحى يا نايم وحد الدايم لا إله إلا الله رمضان كريم.
فوانيس الحارة تنور تحكي عن ضيف جديد يملى قلبي أفراح ويخلي الدنيا عيد. رمضان جانا وفرحنا بعد الزيارة أيام رمضان شهر رمضان جانا وصوت الداعي فينا يبان يملى في كل أذان وحي على القرآن ويملأ الإيمان على الأحباب اسمع دقة الأبواب سفرة حب تجمعنا نتمشى اللي بعد الأيام ضيعنا وفرحنا بعد رمضان شهر
مدينة 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 النبي مدينة 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 النبي.
In my dreams I make my way to Medina, the home and chosen place of our beloved prophet, where all I feel is peace and so much joy around. No better place for me. Yeah, Medina, 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 Nabi, Medina, Medina. That's where I wanna be. Medina, 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 Medina. That's where I wanna be. Oh, oh, Medina, Medina, oh, oh, Medina, Medina. I wake with the morning light in Medina. Everywhere I see blue skies, set above these mountains, bright colors fill the streets, a smile on every face, a special place for me. Yeah, Medina, 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 that's where I'm gonna be. Medina, Medina.
Check, check, check.
That's where
Check, 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 son. Check, 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 check. check, check, check.
على عباد وعليها ثنيات الوداع أجاب الشكر عليها.
Check, 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 check.
Alex sering sombong, rewel, dan berhilangan.
Ini adalah tanda perut sensitif yang sering terjadi pada anak usia dini. Saya rekomendasikan Envagro E Plus MFJM Pro Gentle Care. Dengan DHA lebih tinggi untuk proses belajar lebih cepat dan formula PHP yang lebih mudah dicetak.
Envagro E Plus MFGM Pro Gentle Care. Healthy digestion for A Plus kids.
أيها المبعوث فيها في شتات الآمن المطاع تشرفت المدينة مرحبا يا خير داع مدينة 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 النبي مدينة مدينة that's where I wanna be مدينة 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 النبي مدينة مدينة that's where I wanna be oh, oh, مدينة مدينة oh, oh, مدينة مدينة oh, oh, مدينة مدينة oh, oh, مدينة 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 مدينة
مدينة مدينة مدينة النبي مدينة 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 النبي
هو أحمد ومحمد قلبي محمد في هديه نتعبد قلبي محمد يا ربي صل عليه ما الطير حضر وهو النبي الماحي قلبي محمد الوجه كالمصباح قلبي محمد ما حب نام ونادى نادى لكل فتح نادى لكل فلاح هو أحمد ومحمد بهديه نتعبد يا ربي صل عليه طيرنا ومرض وأحمد ومحمد بهديه نتعبد يا ربي صل عليه طيرنا ومرض وهو النبي الحاشر قلبي محمد ونحن فيه نفاخر محمد من لم يصلي عليه فهو البديع القادر وهو النبي العاقل قمر أضاء كواكب نصف الختام حبيبي على الأحزان منحصر على الآمال مراتب وأحمد ومحمد بهدي نتعبد يا ربي صل عليه طيرنا حرمه وأحمد ومحمد بهدي نتعبد يا ربي صل عليه طيرنا حرمه وأحمد وأنا حبيبي محمد وأحمد ومحمد بهديه نتعبد يا ربي صل عليه طيرنا حرمه وأحمد ومحمد بهديه نتعبد يا ربي صل عليه طيرنا حرمه وأحمد ومحمد. Look around yourself. Can't you see this wonder spread in front of you? The clouds floating by, the sky so clear and blue. Planets in their orbits, the moon and the sun, such perfect harmony. Let's stop questioning ourselves. Isn't this proof enough for us? Or are we so blind to push it all aside? No, we just have to open our eyes, our hearts, and minds. If we just look right, we'll see the signs. We can't keep hiding from the truth. Let it take us by surprise. Protect us in the best way. Guide us every single day. Keep us close to you till the end of time. Look inside yourself, such perfect order, hiding in yourselves, running in your veins. What about anger, love, and pain? And all the things you're feeling, can you touch them with your hand? So are they really there? Let's not questioning ourselves. Isn't this proof enough for us? Or are we so blind to push it all aside? No, we just have to open our eyes, our hearts, and minds. If we just look right to see the signs, we can't keep hiding from the truth. Let it take us by surprise. Protect us in the best way. Guide us every single day. Keep us close to you until the end of time. When a baby's born, so helpless and weak, and you're watching it growing, I deny what's in front of your eyes. The biggest miracle of life. We just have to open our eyes, our hearts, and minds. We just look right to see the signs. We can't keep hiding from the truth and let it take us by surprise. Protect us in the best way. Guide us every single day. Keep us close to you until the end of time. Open your eyes and heart and mind. We just look right and see the signs. We can't keep hiding from the truth. Let it take us by surprise. Protect us in the best way. Guide us every single day. Keep us close to you until the end of time. You created everything. We belong to you. Ya Rab, we raise our hands, forever we thank you. وموعظة ونور
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Professor Mahasin, Professor Abdul Qadir Tayyub, and all participants who already come in this auditorium, online or offline. And we are happy here to have a public lecture from Professor Abdul Qadir Tayyub. I think his name is very famous for us, academia in Indonesia, and his activity every day in South Africa. You can open his profile online. Many books already written and also many journal publications. According to our conversations before this meeting, he is focusing research on like moral economies. But based on my searching information from his profile, we invite him to share his research on decolonizing religious studies. And in Indonesia, I think it is like very timely topic. Many discussion conducted about decolonization. The colonization connected to many areas of studies. Don't know whether this is part of intellectual sexism or part of the true and the effort to find balance to make discourse without any what's called certain bias. And this public lecture conducted by postgraduate school in collaboration with study programs, religious study programs, Faculty of Usuluddin, as well as ASAI, Asosiasi Studi Agama Indonesia, or Indonesian Association for the Study of Religions. Many participants who come online are mostly from community, ASAI community, and also many students who cannot in this room because the limited seat here. Okay, and let's open this public lecture by Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And this public lecture will be led by Professor Nur Ikhwan. And Professor Nur Ikhwan is one of our professor who is very much doing on the colonization issue. And I don't know, maybe the colonization, I guess, will be one of the title of his professor inauguration speech, maybe. And even he has like a YouTube series discussion, yeah, about the colonization issue. I think he is the right man and the right place for leading this discussion. Please, Prof. Nur Ikhwan.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutakin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah amma ba'du. Honorable Speaker, Professor Abdul Karim Tayyub, Professor Muhammad Mahasin, Professor Mutakin, and other professors here. All the participants, both offline and online, and ladies and gentlemen, we are glad that this morning we have Professor Abdul Karim Tayyub. We invite him for an interesting topic discussion. That is the decolonization of the study of religions. It is actually part of the article. It is the title of the article he published in 2019, I think. Yeah, and I think it's important topics to study. Yeah. As part of Mutakin said that 2 years ago, actually, I conducted research on the decolonization of social sciences in Southeast Asia, especially among the Muslim social scientists. And one of the findings is that the decolonization of knowledge is not, it is a marginal topic or interest among especially Indonesian Muslim social scientists. It is surprising enough because Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch colonial government for such a long time, and also by the Japanese occupation. But the interest in the study of decolonization of knowledge is very limited. Yeah. Compared, for example, to the Malaysia, they have, for example, Professor said Hussein Alatas, said Professor said Farid Alatas, and also they have a project of the autonomy of knowledge, and which is I think very interesting. We don't have such kind of project, but we have other epistemic project in the name of, for example, the not Islamic social sciences, but the prophetic Islamic sciences by Professor Kunto Wijoyo of Gajah Mada. And of course, there is a discourse on the indigenization of social sciences, but it is very, very limited interest. There was such kind of interest in the 1950s or 60s in terms of decolonization of Indonesian history of or historiography, and then in 1980s there was also the concern of the indigenization of social sciences, and then disappeared, and then in the beginning of the 2000, around the 2010, there was also discussion about the indigenization of social sciences, yeah, and then disappeared again. And recently, there is a emerging discussion on the decolonization of knowledge, but then also decolonization of religion and also religious governance. There was a conference held by the consortium of Indonesia and Netherlands Consortium for Muslim Christian Relations 2 years ago about the decolonization of religion, and they have a such project cooperation in the decolonization of religion and religious governance in Indonesia and also in the Netherlands. And today we will listen to the lecture by Professor Abdul Karim Tayyub, but I would like to introduce him as Professor Mutakin said that is already known by students of religious studies because some of his books, I think, very famous here. For example, about the mosque imam and sermons. I use also this book for my students in my class. Yeah, so it is interesting. Professor Abdul Karim Tayyub holds the chair in Islam, African Publics and Religious Values at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He completed the PhD at the Temple University. So it is the alumni of Professor Ahmad Rafiq, the head of the PhD program here. Also, I think also in the Department of Religion with the dissertation entitled Islamic Historiography, the case of Tarikh Tabari or Tabari's Tarikh Ar-Rusul wal Muluk on the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. Professor Abdul Karim Tayyib was the ISIM chair at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. So we met before because I was at the moment PhD student and actually at Tilburg University, but I was also associated with the International Institute for Asian Studies, IIAS at Leiden. So I have an office there, and also I attended some program at ISIM. ISIM is International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World. It was established in 2001, I think, and then unfortunately ended in 2009 when I was there for my postdoctorate program. It is interesting. It's like the ICRS here. It is a consortium of some universities, Utrecht, Leiden, Amsterdam, and Nijmegen, Radboud, and Groningen, I think. Yeah. So it is interesting. Professor Abdul Karim Tayyub published extensively on the history of religious movement and institutions in South Africa, and also about Islamic historiography and public life, Islam and public life, and also contemporary intellectual trends in the modern Islam, as well as now he has a project on moral economy of Islam. Without further ado, I invite Prof. Abdul Karim Tayyub for delivering the speech. Please, the floor is yours. I think it's about 1 hour. Yeah, please.
Thank you very, very much for this kind introduction. So, sure that. So it's really a great opportunity for me to address you and to share some thoughts with you on decolonization. I have been, first of all, thank you very much for that introduction. It's really great to be here. In the little time that you were here, it seemed like my connection has been quite long. It's my fault that I have only come back now after a long time. I hope that we can, continue this conversation, over this topic and perhaps others as well, and that, establishing better connection between certainly Indonesian universities and African universities, in particular South Africa. So this topic on decolonization, I have been thinking about, as Professor Nurihwan said. I published a small paper which suddenly has become quite well known. But it was a thought piece as such, thinking about it. But since then, I have been continuing to think about this, and I have actually a paper that is ready. So when which is not published, and so when I was given this title, I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. Only last night I was thinking, well, do I really have something more to say on this? I think I do, and I like to share some thoughts with you, and I hope that we can have a conversation on that. So my first question that I would like to start with is that maybe just to raise the question whether decolonization is actually possible. I think we need to start with that. It might be a desire on our part, but we have to sometimes, we have to, in a sense, face the reality of where we are located. And I've got here a picture of, maybe some of you recognize this picture. It is a statue of Cecil Rhodes, which is based right on our campus. You can see the campus in the background, but this is right there. And in 2015, there was a very big, student protest against the symbols of colonization that are still existing within in the country. I mean, on the campus. That actually put especially for South Africa, that put the question of decolonization right in the center. And many of us were questioned about whether we have done enough, of decolonization, given South Africa's history of 20 years after apartheid, and whether we actually accepting this, these kind of symbols as such. What the students did is that they removed that, they basically tried to remove the statue, which was actually a very big thing as such. So they put a board around it, to sort of to completely not be able to see it as such. When I was looking on my archive, and this is where this photographs comes from. So I actually had this photograph. This photograph was taken in 2010 by one of my students. In 2010, I organized a small photographic project, and I told my students, okay, go around the city of Cape Town. I want you to take photographs of religious places. And so one of my students, who happened to be from Kenya, took this photograph, and he said, well, this is what it is. So when I look back at it, I mean, I can talk a lot about how is it that one forgot this Rhodes as such, or how it had become a kind of a symbolic figure, from the perspective of the students, and then it became a question in 2015. So I think perhaps that in itself tells us about decolonization, that decolonization is there, but somehow it sort of questions that which is we tend to sort of assume. We tend to even ignore the fact that how much colonization is present. Now, obviously, after 2015, this was very prominent. And I must say that for many of us walking past the statue over the time, I started teaching at the university in 1990, it seemed like it was just become the everyday. So part of just being in our world today, a colonized world, I would like to call it, the aspects of it we don't recognize. When we think back, as we did on 2015 and then since then we realize that actually it's not entirely as if we're not aware of it. I want to start first with the idea that it becomes an everyday colonization, I mean. But there has been an attempt, which I think, the question that I would like to ask is that, can we think about what we have done before? And I think Professor Nirihwan was mentioning some of those, that perhaps, let me just try and move so the question is obviously where to begin. And the place where I would begin with decolonization, unlike the people who are sort of at the moment who are leading decolonization, they said we have to completely de-link ourselves. So I would say that no, first of all, we have to recognize that colonization is actually there, present in the way that I've described in this picture. But secondly, and therefore we cannot ignore the colonial and the post-colonial. We cannot ignore the colonial, certainly, because of its shadow, over the last 200 years. But we should also begin to recognize the post-colonial. By post-colonial, I mean the the kind of projects that I think that have been people have been engaged in various forms, at least since the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism. From that time, although you can find traces of it earlier, Edward Said put it on the map to say that the way the social sciences were being done, the way the humanities were being constructed in the modern world, you know, had this character which he called Orientalism. And I think that awareness has been present, and the various projects that you mentioned, for example, you mentioned that you don't have decolonization, but you have a lot of postcolonial. Postcolonial meaning that there's a kind of a border thinking. On the one hand, you're working with the human sciences that are coming from the north as such, from the global north, and on the other hand, you cannot ignore the intellectual traditions of what we are part of. And then the study of Islam, particularly, we have seen a lot of that. I mean, I was at Temple University and I was introduced to the Islamization of knowledge by Professor Ismail Faruqi. But Ismail Faruqi's project was to say, you have to look at the contemporary social sciences, and then you have to start to Islamize them. So in a way, you can see that that's not delinking, but that's basically, it's from the perspective of decolonization, you are still somehow linked with the present. My argument for my presentation today is that we cannot ignore both those dimensions. We cannot ignore the colonial, but we cannot ignore the attempts that are made to overcome the colonial, whether they are perfect or not so perfect, whether they are completely linked or not. I would like to emphasize that unlike most decolonial scholars, my argument is to say that we have to, and I will demonstrate to you in the study of religion, why is it important to remember the post-colonial scholarship. Just remember, that is my first thesis. My second argument to share with you today is that one of the ways we can do that in the study of religion is look very closely at religion in the global south. So you will see how I contrast between the post-colonial critique, which is one dimension, and then more than the post-colonial critique, I think one needs to look at the history of religion in the global south. I'm going to share that with you in South Africa, in some of the Middle East, perhaps, for example, but particularly South Africa. And I'm sure that by looking at religion in this part of the world, in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia, perhaps that provides an opportunity from where you start, because there is religion and religion in a particular way in which I will come to that. My third thesis, or my third point, is that one of the ways to develop post-decolonial is to begin with the retrieval of ethical questions from the archive of religious discourses. By looking at religion not in the usual way, but in a way that I would like to suggest is an ethical question. And again, I will share with you how I have arrived at this from South Africa, but perhaps we can share that with you as well. So these 3 points that I'm going to try and explore with you. First is that we cannot ignore the fact that Cecil Rhodes was sitting there for a long time while the lecturers and while the students were engaging in some kind of post-colonial studies. So I don't think in Cape Town in 2015, colonialism was actually promoted, but there was certainly a lot of post-colonial thought. My second thing that one needs to look closely at that post-colonial thought, because I think it has some value in how we think about our present as such. And secondly, I want to look at the religion in the global south and then propose some kind of solutions, ways forward. Okay. So let me share with you a brief reflection on how the study of religion, and I'm sure you are familiar with the study of religion, has responded to the rise of religion in the global world. As you know, in 1960s and 70s, when you look at studies in the social sciences on the study of religion, there was almost an expectation that religion was not going to be so important. At least it will be important for personal life, but it's not going to be a public dimension. Secularization thesis, it was not really proved, but it was assumed. But what have the scholars done in response to that, in their recognition that there is religion in the public sphere? I would say that there are three major dimensions of it. I'm going to just throw them at you. If you want more elaboration, you can come back to me. But the material turn, the idea that some scholars say, let's look at the material of religions. We should not only look at religion as something that is interior, that is something that is for your personal orientation. Birgit Meyer from the Netherlands has championed this particular position, that she says that the whole idea of religion in the contemporary, in the modern world, because it is derived from a Protestant understanding, that religions in essence is something to do with the personal orientation. And she's saying, no, when we look at Africa, you look at, and then also the rest of the world, religious people are much more engaged with the material, that the things that are around there, the pictures, the symbols of religion always have some kind of materiality. The Quran, the books, the tasbih that you have, everything, you have to start from the material. You should not start from the interior. So, and that has an elaborate sort of discussion, at least for the last 10 or 15 years as such. The second dimension, particularly in anthropology of religion, has been an ethical term. One should focus. Lambeck, people, you might have heard of Lambeck, maybe Talal Asad as well. There has been an ethical turn. We should basically look at the ethics of ordinary life. And that has been a significant dimension in the study of religion. But the ethical dimension here has been on elaborating how people are expressing their freedom, for example, when they are practicing something. So, for example, it would be that when you are, practicing Islam, for example, it's not necessarily the focus on whether you conform, but more importantly, when you are expressing your own freedom, whether to perform your prayer or not. How do you perform your prayer? That's your individual freedom. That is what the ethical scholars actually have emphasized. And thirdly, there has been a study of the fact that, the symbols of religions are everywhere. So initially, they used to be confined to religious traditions, but now you see them in politics, you see them in economics. Everywhere is being, you just see, we have an overflow of religious symbols. One of my former colleagues is also retired now. I'm part of that retirement. Professor David Chittister wrote some really interesting work on how one should not be studying religion only in religious traditions, but one should recognize the flow of symbols, especially derived from religion everywhere in public life as such. My response to that is that this new turn of the study of religion, recognizing the presence of religion in the public sphere, has been focused, its main focus has been on experience and freedom. Main emphasis has been on the experience of religion, for example, material religion. How do you experience a religion now? Still, no longer with the self, but also, again, with the idea of the things out there. And secondly, the idea of the ethics has not been so much on values, on certain kinds of practices, but the freedom that one expresses. I've written some papers on analyzing some of the key directions in these terms as such. But this is a bit of a criticism from my part. That if you're only focusing on experience and freedom, you are re-emphasizing the idea of religion that emerged in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, with people like famous German scholar, but I forget his name right now, Schleiermacher emphasized the idea, for example, that the essence of religion, the main thing about religion is about the experience. So his idea has since been developed quite extensively over that period of time. And the idea that, when you're looking for the true nature of religion, you will find it and how people experience religion. I'm not necessarily saying that's missing and that's not important. I'm saying to put all the emphasis only on experience and to return to the idea that the true meaning is this experience. It's really connecting us to a particular 19th century colonial understanding of religion. And freedom also, I think, is an Enlightenment discourse. And I think the ethical scholars, I think it's good that they're pointing out to the ethics, but when you closely analyze them, they are emphasizing the idea of freedom. Again, it's not something that I want to deny or reject as such, but I think it doesn't take us out of a particular orientation of the study of religion. What is most important, I think, is that the political and economic spheres, that the whole idea of modernity, which celebrates the idea that you have different spheres of life. For example, politics is there, religion is there, economics. Each of these are different, for example, remain untouched and they remain dominant. So we are during this period of time, we have the development of neoliberal economics. We have the proliferation of the modern state as the absolute power, and we can see that demonstrated, especially in the last few months, for example, that is not touched or that is not challenged in the study of religion as such. So that remains dominant. So what I'm presenting here is some maybe a bit of a quick critique, and I'm opening to your suggestion. Maybe I've got it wrong as such, but I feel that this is my assessment of the study of religion currently. It's recognizing religion in public life, but it's using mainly the theories of religion that were developed in Europe through the European experience. And so we cannot get out of that. I want to share with you now some thoughts. You might have known it already, but just some thoughts on what do we mean by decolonial. But just briefly, Grossvogel, one of the leading scholars of decolonialism, basically emphasizes that if we want to be decolonial, we have to break with the Western canon in the human sciences and social sciences. We have to basically challenge the archive, So normally what we do is when we quote people, it's Weber or it's Marx or it's Kant. I mean, it's very difficult to get out of that canon as such. And so what Ramon Grossvogel is suggesting that we need to start break with that canon. We need to find a different way of doing the social sciences. And his second point is that we must begin to accept this pluriversal perspective. His argument is that the modern social sciences keep on looking for one theory to explain everything. There's this one theory that there's the simple theory that, like Marx did, or like Max Weber did, or like, examples of some of the more recent scholars did, continue every day, or the play of religion. There's one theory that has to explain everything. Grossvogel is saying, no, we have to accept the idea that your theories have to be multiple. You don't have to have one only. And thirdly, most importantly, he says, we need to start recognizing the theoretical reflections in the South. When people in the South talk, they are not necessarily just sources of data, but they're also reflecting, they're also giving us some insights and ideas of how to theorize, how to basically look at the world differently. I'm not so sure whether you are familiar with it, but since I thought there are some students, I will do a little bit of do some class work as well, and maybe you can follow this up. There are two scholars who I think have done much in terms of identifying what is decolonizing religious studies. And I want to present to you their main thesis and then show you where I'm going with this. But I thought it's important for me to share that with you. So the first one is by somebody, both of them are Latin American scholars, and both of them are based in America. So that's not delinking completely, but anyway, let's leave that for the moment. Nelson Maldonado Torres. His argument, one of his main arguments in his works on decolonization is to stress that there is a close connection between religious and Enlightenment discourse. And what he says, he sort of traces the history of modernity, not from like most decolonial scholars do, or all decolonial scholars. They don't start from the 18th century with the Enlightenment, but they start with the 15th century with the conquests of America. When the Americas were conquered, there was no Enlightenment at that time. But what there was is Catholic, strong religious states as such. And for the religious states, when they encountered the idolater, people whom they saw as the idolater in America, the idolater in America had to be conquered, had to be killed, or had to be enslaved. Basically, I'm obviously simplifying his idea, but this is the central thesis of what he sees, how the idea of the conquest was sort of justified and given a sort of in this religious meaning as such. Conquered, either you have to conquer them, you have to kill them, or you enslave them. And what is interesting, he says, that the Black person in Enlightenment discourse is almost like the same. Black is in Enlightenment, had to be conquered, had to be killed, or had to be enslaved. And he shows, for example, the close connection between the Enlightenment. So Enlightenment, he argues, doesn't start with something new. Doesn't say now we have to start thinking for ourselves. Its main ideas about the other, in this case, about Black people, was very similar to what the idea of the other was in the American conquest as such. So that's the first way in which he, as you can see, he sort of deconstructs, the relationship between the conquest in the 15th century and the emergence of the Enlightenment discourse. He doesn't accept the Enlightenment discourse as like a starting from a clean slate. I think, therefore I am, of Descartes. Almost like you're starting from nothing. No, you're not starting from nothing. You're already beneficiary of a lot of things that happened in the last 300-400 years. And people like Nelson Maldonado Torres says often, and Dussel, I think Dussel, one of the other scholars of decolonization, says that the Enlightenment was basically a sort of a theory of what was happening in the conquest before. And as a result of recognizing this as as what is colonial modernity is all about, Maldonado Torres says, decolonial is basically an ethical project on the Enlightenment. Let me quote for you. He says, the highest ethical moment is found in reaching of a sub-other to another subject in a position of subalterity. Because of the fact of dehumanization, the point is that he says that that means for a person in Indonesia to reach out to a person in Africa, for example, or vice versa. That means there has to be a much more recognition of the humanity among the subalterns in the world as such. Not necessarily a relationship between the other, which is the dominant other in the self, but between the people or the selves which are being declared non-human. So that is the ethical project that one has to go through in the process of decolonization. It's written 2 books or a number of articles, but you can follow them further. I will pause with him now and then go to the other person briefly. Another scholar who has done some work on decolonization is by the name of An Yun Tai. His work basically emphasizes the fact that the resistance to the colonial was, I'm not so sure whether I would say that he says that universally, but it was not secular. Certainly there was a religious element to it. So when the people in Africa or the people in South America or elsewhere, for example, resisted the colonial, they resisted often in the name of religion. So religion played a very important role in resistance. I know that very clearly within South Africa, the African traditional religious people, they basically resisted very strongly. And it was only much later, for example, the African National Congress came up, when they had become Christian, for example. And some people suggest that that's the beginning of decolonization in South Africa. But An Yun Tai, and I think he's right, even about South Africa, was actually, you have to look at it before the emergence of so-called modern political movements as such. So the resistance to the colonial was not secular. And then the second point of his thesis is to emphasize the pervasiveness of the religious in the world as such. Religion, he says, has survived coloniality and continues to nurture creative accounts of survival and resistance among various communities. So this quotation emphasizes how we need to read the religious, how to basically look at religion as survival and resistance. How do people, turn towards religion in the context of the colonized, in the context. So he says the decolonial must be able to rethink about what is the nature of religion as such. My position actually starts from both of them, emphasizing the nature of the religious, through this long history, and also the continuing vitality of religions. What is religion in the global South? I would like to begin first with the postcolonial critique of religion in order for us to understand, that's the first dimension of understanding what is religion in the global South. My view, I think, postcolonial gives us some kind of an insight. I think that goes a little bit beyond what Torres and An Yun Tai are doing. My second point is to say that we need to go beyond religion as defined in modernity. Now, the second one will become clear after I have described what is the postcolonial of religion. And then thirdly, I want to emphasize retrieving ethical questions. What do I mean by the first one? So I'm going to speak first briefly on the postcolonial critique of religion. I think there are lots of, from the 1980s onwards, you're probably familiar with people like Jonathan Z. Smith, for example. Somehow familiar to you, the name. He's one of the first people to question, what is going on in the study of religion. And some people suggest he himself was, I don't think he was a postmodernist, but basically people think of him as the first person to critique the study of religion in the way that it had been accepted in the contemporary world since the 18th century as such. But when one looks at this critique in the 1980s, one can make a clear distinction between those that are postmodernists and those that are post-colonial. I think it's important to make that distinction because I keep on reading work where that distinction is just simply collided with each other. The postmodern basically say that religion is not real, it is something that is constructed. In the same way that they would say, nothing is real, nothing is really real. It's just through everything is constructed through language. So Islam is not real because Islam is a construction of language. Politics is not something there, it's constructed through language. Religion has been, according to Jonathan Z. Smith, has been constructed by the scholars. The scholars who in the 19th century went out looking for religion. They had to separate it from everything else, and then they created this idea of religion. So in one of his quotations, he says, religion is like linguistics. There's no such thing as linguistics in the world. So what you have is that linguistics is a science of language, but what is in the world is language being spoken. In the same way, religion is a construction, which is a kind of an imaginary idea of the different religions that you have. So that is a kind of a postmodern or a deconstructionist approach, which speaks about how scholars are constantly making this as such. I think the post-colonial are doing something very different, and they are very important for us thinking about decolonial. The post-colonial are, and I've chosen two of them, Talal Asad and David Chidester. As you're probably familiar more with Talal Asad, but you should be familiar with David Chidester as well if you are interested in post-colonial study of religion. And I hope that I will share something with you to encourage you to read him as well. They basically are saying that the religion is constructed. They're emphasizing that religion is constructed in colonial modernity, for colonial modernity. So it's got a presence in the world as well. It's not just simply something only that scholars are engaged in. That linguistics, they haven't said it, but the example of linguistics is not really a very good example because as I will demonstrate to you, both of them show that religion has an effect in the modern world. Let me share with you what Talal Asad is saying. So Talal Asad's work, especially when he speaks about religion, he speaks about religion in the center. That means in the global north. Okay, religion has been constructed. He argues in his book Genealogies of Religion, 1993. Over a period of time in the history of Europe. And religion was defined and constructed in relation to the secular. So the two were co-constructed. As the definition of the secular emerged through science, through the modern state, through law, for example, through administration, it was what happened is that what was not secular was religious, and what was not religious was secular. The two are codependent with each other. The definition, his genealogies of religion, as well as the formation of the secular, articulate that thesis very well. You cannot, think about the understanding of myth, for example, in his formation of the secular, took on a certain kind of meaning when it was completely de-linked from science, when it was de-linked from politics, for example. So myth came to mean subjective meanings. Myth came to mean multiple meanings as such, and that is something associated with religion. But in the process, he's saying that religion, when this examination took place, that when this long history in Europe, he sort of traces it all the way from around the 14th century, when this took place, for example, then religion was de-linked from politics, economics, and science, everything as such. So the process of defining the religious was firstly to separate it from the secular, but more importantly, more specifically for our purpose, it was de-linked from these other spheres as such. Now you don't necessarily, when you do economics, there's no place for religion in there. When you do politics, ideally you should keep it a bit separate. It can have a symbolic role, but other than that, it shouldn't play. That is the first idea of Tala Asad. But this kind of new idea of religion that was now constructed in this process became the basis for religion in the world as well. That the attempt to establish fixed boundaries between populations to reform and standardize their beliefs and to secure their loyalties and to define their community membership, all of this has been central to the project of the modern nation state, which is essentially secular and not religious. So there's a bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, religion is dissociated from politics, but the state is very much interested in, defining what is the religious so that it can keep in its place. So in Talal Asad's way and his there's a book that has been called, Religion Making by Dressler and Dare. Maybe you're familiar with that, who documented globally how this idea that Talal Asad says that whenever you have the modern state, you need to actually have a religion. But what is that religion that you are going to have? It has to be defined, that it has to have a particular role to play. And that redefinition is your religion is being constructed for the modern state, so that it doesn't have anything to do with politics, it doesn't have anything to do with economics. Ideally, it should actually be together with a certain level of secularization. So and Talal Asad is saying that this construction of religion, first in Europe, was then exported and imposed on the rest of the world. To see how you cannot have religion, getting involved in politics, or you cannot have too much of religion in economics, for example, because otherwise it will spoil the practice of these spheres as such. So religion making first started with colonialism, but then progressively elsewhere as well. Again, perhaps the elaboration. If you have any questions, if you're doubting what I'm saying, maybe you can raise those questions again. So Talal Asad, this is the center. This is what happens in Europe, and this is how it is spread throughout the world. Like recently, maybe I should make a point. I've noticed that in many Muslim countries, for example, there's recently been a desire to have religious studies. I know Indonesia has done this a long time ago. South Africa has also done this a long time ago. But it is intriguing that how is it that in the 21st century, Muslim countries are realizing they must have religious studies? Because I think this is part of the modernization process. So now you have to have a religion, because now you have a religion, you have to have religious studies to do so. And what kind of religious studies are you going to have? Well, you can have the same one that you are going to look at in Europe and see how it is being studied. So now you are contributing to the construction of religion. The other person who has done also, so this is, I would call this is for Talal Asad. Before I go to Chedesha, I would say this is a postcolonial. Postcolonial says that this is the nature of religion now in after colonialism, or in the light of colonialism. David Chideste's work has followed a different trajectory. He's actually an American scholar, but he came to South Africa in 1982 and became South African. And at some point, under the influence of Talal Asad, he shifted his focus on how he was a student of Jonathan Z. Smith, and he still maintains that link, but I think he was very much influenced by the post-colonial study of religion as well. He has analyzed what is religion on the colonial frontier. In this case, he specifically looks at places where the conquest has taken place, particularly of indigenous religions. On the colonial frontier, religion was often used as, based on his archival research, religion was a marker of civilization and being human. So you can clearly see Maldonado Torres, what I was saying here. David Chideste showed in his work in a book called Savage Systems, that when the conquest of South Africa, the different groupings was conquered in South Africa, the various colonial officials, the travelers, when an area was not yet conquered, they used to say that these people don't have religion. That there's no religion in the tribe, or there's no such a thing as religion. They don't believe in a single God. They don't have monotheism. They couldn't understand them. But David Chideste says that their understanding of the fact that people don't have religion means that they could be conquered. because they are not quite human. But what is interesting is when they were conquered, then their religions were being studied. So the religions were only studied after conquest, not before conquest. So before conquest, and he showed that in each grouping in South Africa, from the south, in Cape Town, else they explored the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotho, they followed the same practice. Before conquest, they had no religion. After conquest, they had religion. Now you study them and what is your belief, what is your this, what is your rituals, and such. So there is a kind of a kind of a dialectical relationship between having religion and not having religion. That is what he showed in his book. And then he says that because of this kind of history of religion and power, very linked to with religion and not having power. When you have religion, you don't have power. And when you have the power, then you don't have religion. Because we must recognize that Christian beliefs, and he puts it in inverted commas about South Africa, practices and forms of associations have been appropriated by Africans primarily as vehicles of power in a world of increasingly disempowering power relations. So the way that what he calls the imperial study of religion was taking place on the frontier, basically inscribed power relations within religious symbols and religious practices. So when people were responding, or when they were calling upon religion, it was always as an appeal to power. And so power was deeply connected with African religions, with particularly Christian traditions. Or they have no power, or they have power, or they are claiming to be powerful as such. And he's traced that in the public life. He makes that comment in relation to the public life in South Africa, when religious traditions are, places of powerlessness and places of power because of this history of religious study. So what you get here is this, what both Talal Asad and David Chidester are showing us is the nature of religion, in the context of modernity, in the context of what I would say maybe colonial modernity. It is the fact that this is what religion has actually, what is the nature of religion as a result of a kind of a colonial, colonial impact of the construction of religion in the center, and how it has spread out in the world as such. I would argue that when we do any kind of decolonization, even though decolonization says, for example, we have to delink, we cannot delink from this history, because we are still living in that history. We're still living with Cecil Rhodes' statue, in the background as such. So for me, for the study of religion is this particular history. How do we basically delink from this? How do we overcome this particular history? If we don't know this, then we cannot basically delink from this. How do we analyze this particular background? So my next step is actually to say, where do we go from here? How do you go beyond this religion in the global south, beyond the post-colonial? First of all, I think one is to recognize, firstly, that when you look at the study of religion in the global south, now I'm turning towards not Talal Asad or David Chidester, but as somebody who has been reading a lot of Talal Asad, reading about his understanding of religion in the global north, but also his understanding of Islam, as you probably know, his idea of Islam is discourse. I want to go a step beyond both of them to say that. And my argument is, or my suggestion is, that when one looks at religion in the global south, you see an imposition in the way that Talal Asad and David Chidester are saying, but you don't only see that. You also see an ongoing debate going on within religious discourse in the global south. It's not different. It's not simply, if you just look at, and you're probably familiar with, let me call it up again, Islamization of knowledge. When you look at Islamization of knowledge in all of its different variations, right? Whether you agree with them or not, which one is better. Some people champion one or the other, whether it is Naqib al-Attas or Faruqi or Sayyid Hussain Nasser, but the idea that people are thinking that they have to do something different is, for me, something other than just being colonized completely. So for me, that's the starting point to recognize the fact that when people are engaging in this, at least whether it is from the 1920s or whether one looks at it from the 1980s, for example, I think one has to bring that archive into our discussion. So I'm putting it forward as, on the one hand, there is an imposition. We know that there is a kind of a discourse of religion, which we learn from, from Talal Asad and David Chidester, but one cannot ignore the ongoing debate on economics and politics as such. And my view is sometimes Talal Asad, for example, doesn't want to recognize this kind of discussion as such. So the Islamic discourse is not just simply about the practice of Islam, it's also the debate about Islam continuously, as we know from the past and the present. When one looks at independence movements, and I briefly mentioned this already, but I want to emphasize this quite a bit. Independence movements have been studied as either, they are liberal or they are communist, for example, but the place of religion is less studied in there. I mean, I have just done this briefly. When you look for example, the South African war against apartheid, there's a lot of recognition that the church, for example, or Muslim groups, Hindu groups, Jewish and other groups in the 1980s, basically, engaged anti-apartheid struggle quite extensively, even though there was a lot of debate among them, but they certainly did that. But when you start looking at what was the role of religion in Zimbabwe, for example, then the role of African traditional religions is actually hardly recognized for what they participated. And yet, when you look at testimonies, there's a lot of that. Or look at the Mau Mau. I'm going to take examples from Africa because I know them better. The Mau Mau, also a very major anti-colonial, British colonial movement as such. It's often recognized as being very violent as such, but its roots in the local religious tradition is hardly ever theorized, hardly ever recognized as such. And I mean, the examples of Islam, I think maybe you have knowledge of as such. So that independence movements, being involved in political movements, in political liberation movements, are not recognized in the history of religion as such. Because the history of religion speaks about differentiation. You don't get involved in politics. Or if you do politics, you are just blessing whatever is going on, but not necessarily mobilizing groups as such. So I think that needs to be spoken about as such. And when you look at the Global South, it's very difficult in general to separate experience of religion and the critique of religion inside there. So there's constantly, there's a lot of practice of religion. People participate in religious traditions, certainly within South Africa. But at the same time, at the heart of religion is this religious discourse. There's always a kind of a debate because people are not quite happy with where they are at any particular time. I think one needs to take at least these three very important pillars for decolonization. Let me come to my penultimate section, where I'm suggesting that maybe one way of doing this is to do through ethics. And I'm going to share with you my own journey and how I think how I've arrived at it, and also perhaps some ideas of where we can go further with this. So I was doing a project in South Africa on the study of religion in schools. In the South African government before 1994, during apartheid and before, Christian studies was the dominant form of religious education. Everybody had to learn something about Christianity. I mean, we grew up knowing much more about the Bible than anything else. We had to say the Lord's Prayer. Then at some point, the Indian schools, because we were categorized, or we are recognized as Indians in South Africa. Then they thought, oh, you're not Christians, although they are Indians of Christians of Indian origin, but then they reduced that a little bit. But generally, for most of the schools, particularly the Black African schools, Malay schools, colored schools, for example, Christianity was the central. So after 1994, the government decided to change the policy on religious education. They wanted to introduce religious education for everybody. And so they set up a policy. There was a lot of debate and discussion about this, whether this is a good idea or not. Basically, when I was doing this project, we were trying to document what was going on in the schools. And we were also interested in teaching and informing and equipping the teachers in order to no longer to focus only on one tradition, but to focus on religious traditions itself. But one of the things that we came up with, that we realized, is that the government's policy on religious education had a lot of ethics involved in it, because the government was interested in teaching religion, for the society in general. The policy was favoring the idea that you have to recognize the value of other religious traditions. You have to be able to live with other religions close, who are your neighbors. You have to live as good citizens, but from your own religious traditions as well. But we realized that the discipline of religious studies had not done sufficiently to teach us about ethics. I don't know whether you are doing something different, but when we study religion, or when we teach religion in the universities, we teach about identity, we teach about community, and we teach about individuality, but we don't teach about ethics. Sometimes ethics comes up in these things, but generally ethics is not a separate issue. It's because of the fact that in the 19th century, even though Immanuel Kant was one of the first to articulate religion as basically ethics, from Schleiermacher onwards, the emphasis has been much more in the study of religion about how do you perceive the absolute? How do you experience the absolute? How do you basically have a community that you are all connected with each other? How do you basically have yourself, but not about ethics? Because ethics has been taken nicely out, put into philosophy or put into theology. Study of religion, in my estimation, when I was doing this, whenever we were bringing in our colleagues, and we were saying, okay, we have to now teach the teachers how to teach religion, we had a lot to say about experience, and we had a lot to say about community, but we didn't have much to say about what the government wanted us to do, was ethics. So this started my awareness that actually we need to think again about how can we actually how can we introduce ethics in the study of religion, in religious education. And that meant rethinking how it has been excluded from the study of religion generally. What we also realize is that when we study public life, for example, again, public life is a very big topic. It has been debated quite extensively from the end of the Cold War. You probably know the tradition. Habermas was introduced as a major figure, for example, who sets up a model of how to have engagement in public life, religious engagement in public life as such. But public life was very much documented as competing identities. That in public life, you have your opportunity to present yourself, and you have to have an equal representation in public life. So we concern very much about how, sometimes in South African schools, for example, again, if I show that people were quite disturbed in many South African schools for children who were Rastafarian. Rastafarian are, a new African Christian religious tradition, believing in practices that would be unacceptable to schools. And in South African schools, one of those practices has been wearing dreadlocks, having a particular kind of head gear, for example, or at least hair. We had lots of children who were being expelled from schools because that. I'm sorry, I didn't remember. I should have brought you a photograph. If you look at it, you won't even think that they are disturbing. But it obviously, such identities disturb the public sphere. So I think it's important, but underlying that emphasis on the fact that everybody has to be accepted is also the fact that it's a good thing that everybody who has an individual identity should actually be accepted within the society, whether you are somebody wearing a hijab, like women in South Africa. Also, there were some girls in high school basically who were expelled, or who at least who were not permanently expelled, but who were it was demanded of them to change their headgear until the court intervened and basically set their records straight. On the case of the Rastafarians as well, the court had to go, these issues went all the way up to the Supreme Court until the Supreme Court decided that no, the schools must accept the policies as such. But the emphasis I'm putting here is that the public life, again, is the study of competing identities. Again, there's a lack of consideration of what kind of ethics are you involved here. I think it's still a very too limited a reflection on identities. More importantly, I would say ethics in the differentiated spheres as such. If one speaks about, these differentiated spheres I'm speaking about in the light of modernity. We know that I'm going to be emphasizing much more on politics and economics. Now, some people might suggest, okay, what we do have is Islamic politics is somewhat different as such. But I think that one should begin to think about ethics in those kind of differentiated spheres as well. There's an opportunity if one starts looking at, is there a space for thinking about ethics in politics and economics much more than what we have done so far? Again, I would argue that there's a much more emphasis on identity when people emphasize Islamic politics, or when one emphasizes African politics, but not necessarily the ethical dimension that is going there. I've looked much more closely at moral economies, and this is why I want to just elaborate a little bit on this. Moral economies, some people might suggest, whenever I mention this, some people immediately pick up, isn't that a contradiction in terms? No. And you actually have morality in economics, because economics is driven by, Adam Smith, lots of different ideas have come up since then, but basically it's a movement, it's an exchange of goods on the basis of an exchange of money. It's a valuation that is based on valuation of what people think is the value of something. And if you are interfering in economics, for example, with any kind of morality, with any kind of ideas, for example, you will soon find that your business is not going to work. So you can have different politics, you can have different hijabs, you can have different hijab styles, you can have different styles of clothing, but you cannot have more than one economy, modern world. And I think this is a very big challenge for the study of religion, but also for religious people to think about, economies that are beginning to think about, at least in which one begins to think about morality. My project has been to look at certain moral economies that one finds in the world today, but that are often not recognized, either because these economies don't want to be part of the global economy, or they are often being rejected by the global economy. So the capitalist economy is very good at either drawing you in, but also spitting you out. So sometimes if there's not much value for you, where you are taken out of the economy. I think with AI, we're going to see a lot of that happen. But when you're looking at these spaces, for example, in my case, I've looked at a number of African countries. When you look at practices, how people are recovering, particularly Islamic values, sometimes they're doing it very consciously, but sometimes they're not openly conscious about this, because Islamic values are sometimes practiced, sometimes unconsciously as such. Gift economies, for example, that those places need to be, we can recover an ethical tradition there as well. Is what I would like to call an archive of economies. Now, in my case, for example, because I'm working on Islam and moral economies, I'm not starting with the modernity, but I'm looking at how in the history of Islamic thought, the scholars were constantly reflecting on how to earn a living. That area, there have been a few studies done on this, but to see the whole history of it, and all of it was not necessarily very good. I must hasten to add, for example, I'm not saying that the archive of Islamic economics, it had slavery, it had a lot of exploitation, but it also had a deliberation of what is it to be just in a relationship as such. How do you develop certain kinds of trade, for example, or certain kinds of manufacture of crafts, for example, that are related to ethical practice? I published one essay on Ibn Khaldun as a first step in that direction. So my point here in this particular slide is to think about how to put ethics, which has been excluded from the study of religion, how one can bring it back inside, as something that is required within the societies, and secondly, what has often been forgotten, and I think are being recovered in different ways, whether it is in the communities that I'm looking at, but I would like to include Islamic economics also in this kind of projects, to see it, not necessarily to reject it completely, but to see how it can be, how it has fared over a period of time. So, so in conclusion, let me point out to you some of the points that I've been making, and I hope that I can open that up for your questions and discussion. I think there's a real challenge of decolonization in the present. In the present time, It's much easier to say we're going to decolonize than actually to do it. They are far from, completely thinking about dealing. And maybe one need to think of dealing only as a step because, we live in a global world. I'm not necessarily think that you can completely dealing, but certainly it's a good practice to begin to become aware of what are the archive, what is the archive as scholars that we are using, what are the theories that you're using, what these theories actually mean, and what is our present as such. I suggested to you the value of the post-colonial. The value of the post-colonial, unlike most decolonization attempts who say that post-colonial is still connected to the colonial, just in terms of the name, and much of the thinking has gone on in the global north about what is the post-colonial. So in that sense, it is so. But I feel that the post-colonial, unlike the post-modern, gives us a sense of what the world has become in the light of the colonial. I feel that that's the place where we should, we have to, that has to be part of the archive of the decolonial, even if it is the first step that we make. The third point I'm saying is that we need to pay attention to the history of religion in the South. By the history of religion, I mean the history of religion in the South has, the practice of religion, the deliberation, the reflection on religion has taken on different forms in the global South. That certainly we need to be recovered, not necessarily as a script, that follows a particular direction. So if one is going to only follow 19th century theories of the study of religion, I would argue that they are, and even 20th century theories of religion, I think they are going to tell us much more about the history of religion in the global north, not so much of the history of religion in the global south. I hope I've given you some ideas, maybe not the final word on this, but at least sufficient ideas of where to go, where to look for, and which doesn't follow the kind of script. You're not expecting religion to be involved in economics. We're not expecting religion to be mobilized for politics, because exactly at the time when religion was being mobilized, for example, in the global south, if I could just share with you, for example, the 1960s and 70s, when the secularization was being rolled back, for example. And we saw, and that was demonstrated certainly by the Islamic Revolution of Iran in a very clear way. In the 1980s, for example, the emphasis was much more on deconstruction in the global north. But during that time, in the 1980s, religion was being mobilized in the global south. So you can see at the same time, the world is doing something different. Deconstruction, Foucault, everybody this is the dominant time of religion, at least the study of society, the study of religion as well was being deconstructed. But in the global south, we have a different history. I feel that history needs to be, it still means that you have to do your work, you have to do your homework, you have to look at the archives, you have to do some work, but you have to follow a different kind of a script, and I hope that we can share that in you. My final point is that there are significant resources within religious discourses for engaging ethics in differentiated spheres. By not following the particular script of, if you say you're only interested in the identities of the public space, for example, and not interested in the ethics, then I think you are just following the script. So I would say that the resources in religious discourses, certainly in the case of the study of Islam, which I know better of, but in Christianity, in other religious traditions as well, I think there's much more to be gained by critically or by looking at the scripts in a much more significant way. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Tayyub, for very inspiring lecture. And would not conclude that, I think, because Professor Tayyub has, described the trends and the problems of the decolonization of knowledge of religious studies. and it is problematic and challenges. And I think if we look at the title of the first slide, is decolonization possible? So the answer perhaps is it is possible, but cannot we cannot delink fully from the global south. But what should we do is to insert ethics, if not mistaken in my conclusion, in the religious studies. Okay, I think I would like to open question and answer session. Please, in the back. Pak okay. Pak Ajar, and then you. Okay, and from here, woman. Okay, Pak Ajar first.
Yeah,
Please.
thank you very much for the time. My name is Ajar Permono. Actually, I'm old student in graduate studies here. My question first is about the reinserting ethics. You mentioned that it could be connected to the other sphere, like politics and economic. But actually, right now, the other important thing is environment. I think it could be also engage the ethics and environment treatment. Do you agree with that? This is the first statement and the first question. And the second is actually, this is theoretical manner. Yeah. You mentioned about the Schleier measure connected the ethics here, experiments of ethics. As I know, Friedrich Schleier measure is the theory is divided into two. First is grammatical, and secondly is physiological. You mentioned that ethics maybe is because the experience of physiological, like person now should be come into the past by physiological manner. Maybe like this. My question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Ajar. Pak Ajar just defended his dissertation before Ramadan, I think. Yeah.
Environmental.
No, his dissertation is on about the Quranic hermeneutics. Okay, thank you. And the second one, Pak siapa?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Who handed, Prof? Alhamdulillah.
Abdul Qadir.
My name is Fatur. I would like to asking some question from beautiful lecture from you. In my opinion, this in Indonesia like two different madhab, two different school about Islamic institution, like some Islamic university like use Western system in the theory and etc. And some institution as well, there is like use traditional knowledge, like in pesantren we call. And I've been to UCT as well, and I saw some same issue in South Africa as well. My question is, what the ideal from your perspective for the future religion studies, and what your suggestion for like me, student of knowledge, for make research about this topic. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
I think two first, please.
So thank you, both of you, for those questions, comments. I agree with you. Certainly, environmental ethics can be added to that. I was just using those as examples. I think environmental ethics also brings in the question of science. For example, if one looks at specifically at questions of the environment, then I think it's not only the protection, but I think certainly I would agree that these are the spheres, science as well as economics, because we know the exploitation of the environment has happened through certain kinds of economic practices as such, and still continues very, very dominant at the moment, and we see the effects of that recently. So I would agree with you, and thanks for bringing that to my attention. I haven't thought a lot about it, but I've seen that you have a project here, so on environmental ethics. But I would like to see whether you included in it, as I said, questions of science and questions of economics that are directly impacting on it as such. I wouldn't like it to be, at least for the environmental ethics, one has to, again, you cannot do environmental ethics without understanding what is the present, where we are, how we have come to what we are doing now. So I agree with you. Thanks very much for that. But Schleiermacher, yeah, I mean, I've read his own religion, didn't read as much as you have done, you seem to have done. But I was saying that Schleiermacher was the person who used the model of Immanuel Kant. Whereas Immanuel Kant was saying the essence of religion is actually ethics, he's in his own way, what is ethics in his way. Schleiermacher was emphasizing the idea of experience of religion. So he used the same model to speak about how do we study religion between its essence and its particularity. And Schleiermacher was saying, no, the essence is not ethics, it is actually experience. Because he was articulating this. Maybe you don't agree with that, but that's what I was saying, that he was not so much interested as much interested in ethics as he was in experience. And I think that when I read people who are turning to Schleiermacher, I see that they are following that particular tradition. So that is why I was bringing that up as somebody whose work has had a big influence in the study of religion, even continues to have an influence, but about keeping religion around experience, not necessarily around ethics. Atullah, thanks very much for bringing in, you speak Afrikaans very well. I grew up in an Afrikaans language town, but I'm sorry, I cannot speak, I still understand Afrikaans very well and I can speak, but niet so goed meer nie. But you learn Afrikaans very quickly, that in South Africa. Yeah, okay. So I think your question is obviously very important, central. In a way, I think the decolonization move basically, in my sense, helps us to recognize the value of the pesantren and traditional schools. And I think that Indonesian pesantren, some of them at least certainly are leading the way in what you are asking as such. But I still think that there's the two separation as such is still too dominant as such. We need to find a way of bringing them together. I sort of believe at the moment, obviously one changes one's mind, but I do think that there's a lot of value in reading some of the intellectual history carefully and critically in the light of our present. So one cannot ignore the fact that the world has changed significantly, and there's been a significant amount of value as well in how we read things in the moment. I have a lot of students who are from the Darul Ulooms or from traditional education, and so with them, for example, I find that I have to help them to see, some of the tools that one gets in the social sciences and humanities, the different questions that are being asked. On the other hand, when I have people who don't have that background, I have to tell them, no, you have to read a little bit more of the two schools. So it seemed like the two have to be together in depth. Sometimes when you bring them together too closely, then you miss one or the other. So for the moment, that's what I'm thinking. I've benefited from being exposed to traditional knowledge without necessarily trying to understand it in a kind of a modern way. And I have also benefited from social sciences and the philosophies, because this is the world in which we are living. I don't know, maybe that's not enough of an answer to you, but I think you've asked a question that people have been asking for a long time, and maybe one has to think carefully about the response to that.
Okay, I think I will invite from the online audience, perhaps there is a question. Please raise hand. No? Okay, because we are run out of time. Please, Pak Najib, and then Pak Latiful Khuluk in the back. And woman, please, woman voice, please. Woman voice, please. Okay, Pak Najib.
Thank you. I'm Najib from School of Graduate Studies. Thank you for very insightful and happy topics of this discussion this morning. I'm interested in your proposal to reinserting ethics in the study of in the context of decolonizing study of religions, and we have to pay attention to the history of the religion in global south instead of the the global north that already done by the existing scholar like Assad and others. And then as my knowledge about the ethics, I think there is at least two dimensions of ethics. Yeah, you already explained about particularly from Talal Assad and his student. Ethical thing, yeah. For example, like Sabah Mahmud and Charles Sissin, who are focusing on ethical thing in terms of the Aristotelian, and then Lambeck, who is focusing on ordinary ethics. Yeah. So to me, it's reminded me to some scholar who are already done some studies on economies as well in relation to ethics in global south, maybe. For example, like Suarez, yeah, from Africa, who is writing about a prior economy, and also Andrea Mokhliba, who is writing about moral neoliberal. So there's something contradictory, in terms, but we can see how this kind of alternative, and also Amira Mittermeier of Mona Atia in Egypt, pious neoliberalism. Yes. And also Daru Medudinsky working on Indonesia, spiritual economy. So we call them as alternative economies. So my question is, as my understanding about this academic debate on this topic, they try to link the notion of religious studies or religion to the context of neoliberal. Yeah. But in Africa, it's reminding to Kamarov who are working about occult economies as well. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Najib. Pak Latiful Khuluk, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Latiful Khuluk. I'm currently teaching economic and politics and empowerment. But I have two questions related to economy and one related to terrorism. I'm often irritated with the sermons in the mosque or usually in the khutbah or pengajian, that many in Indonesia, they kind of reluctant or opposing quote unquote capitalism or market oriented vis-a-vis praying or going to mosque. Usually they oppose people to do activities in the market, but on the other hand, they ask us to do sodako. So it is a contradictory. And related to that, we have also discussion about, especially in Indonesia, we have two largest mass organization like Muhammadiyah and NU. Muhammadiyah usually people related to like uh, uh, capitalism or what Calvinism, and NU is and the other one, yeah, more like fatalism, yeah. My question is how this kind of debate about market versus mosque, yeah, maybe in your area, in your region, yeah, in South Korea or India, I don't know, related to this, or maybe about in Iran or Shiite or in Sunni, like that, yeah. And the second one, I have a statement like this, but whether you agree or not, terrorism is a byproduct of colonialism, yeah, yeah, or modern colonialism, and Wahhabism as well is byproduct of colonialism. Maybe if not colonialism, is modernization. They oppose or they contradict with the colonialism and modernism by doing return to the basic, to the prophet era in a very rigid or very extreme way, yeah, by what, yeah, they oppose modernization and many impact of colonization. Thanks.
Please, thank you, Pak Latif. Please, yeah.
So thank you very much. I hope that you have all heard the questions, because sometimes the questions have a lot of values for reflection. So even if I'm not going to be able to answer them, but I think that I'll respond to them. I think both of them open up important questions as such. The first one with Najib. I mean, you're right. You seem to be well read on the moral economies, and I've looked at almost all of them, all of the people that you're citing. I think that the scholarship itself seems to indicate, on the one hand, for example, Benjamin Suarez's work, for example, is a very earlier one, for example, where he speaks about the prayer economy in Mali, around, giving, I don't know what you call it here, but tawiz, or, some kind of a protection, in exchange for, some kind of gift, for example. But he was suggesting, for example, that kind of moral economy is going to disappear, because it was part of the old moral economy. Now the new one is coming up as such. Some of the people that you are citing actually talk about, say, occult economies, but they are traded like normal economies. They are traded like capitalist economies. It depends on how much of, support you can get for your product, as it were, and so I think that the Mittermeier is a bit different, I feel, because she is speaking about, how some of the people are giving in the name of God without wishing to have a kind of a return as such. So all of these are anthropologists, certainly, not the study of religion, which I think one has to mention. But you have to read them, because obviously they are giving you some insights as such. That's why I'm saying that the study of religion has not looked at it. And therefore, one of the things that we see is, where do these ideas come from? So if my point of this is can we find a way of adding new questions to what is going on in the society? I feel that the idea of exchange, the idea of a market exchange, is a dominant framework. And then there's the idea that at the end of the day, when people give out charity, they are doing it for themselves. So there's a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. A lot of the studies, you will see how they're doing this. As I said, Mittermeier is different, because she's exploring that as such. But, for example, I would, in my study, to give you an idea of where my direction would be in relation to the scholarship as such, when I looked at Ibn Khaldun, for example, he opens up the discussion. What is the source of wealth, he says? How do you actually what is the meaning of wealth, he's arguing, he's saying in one of his books. And he says there are two types of wealth. One of them is called rizq, and the other is called kasb. He says that rizq is the wealth that you get for nothing. And kasb is what you acquire for yourself. Now, for me, bringing in those kind of values in the study of economy is to recognize the fact that you are not necessarily only the product of your own doing, you're also the product of what you are getting from somebody else as such. Obviously, he's talking about the rizq as coming from God, for example. But in one of his comments, for example, he says, let's look at the question of inheritance. And he describes what is inheritance. Inheritance is the person who is receiving the inheritance, that's rizq for them, because they're getting it for nothing. I mean, more or less, obviously, from your parents. But the kasb is what you have, when it is in the person who is giving the inheritance, that is kasb for him. But the person who's receiving it is rizq. For me, it sort of brings up an important alternative values than exchange that one thinks about. So that's where I feel that the study of religion can actually contribute to what you are saying here. Because otherwise, I think that the anthropologists are exploring different dimensions, like, as I said, Amira Maturmaya, she's saying that this idea that there's no way in which I don't want a benefit from myself, you know. She's talking to the people who are giving charity in Egypt, and she says that there's no way in which I can see that they are looking at it for themselves. So, and I think that is the beginning of what I would say is at least one dimension of moral economies that I'm looking at, you know. Ibn Khaldun also speaks about other kinds of moral economies, which I think opens up. I've just given you one illustration, which helps us to ask different questions, what people are doing, or what people may actually do. And I feel that the study of religion should not only be on what people are doing, but also what they can possibly do. But you obviously work on actually engaging with them to see what they are doing and where you can contribute to the continuing development of these economies. I don't know if that's sufficient for you for a moment as such, but that's where I feel we can be looking at these current economies by asking different kinds of questions and not necessarily reducing them to the dominant models. And I feel that in capitalism itself, I mean, within capitalism, there are people who talk about moral economies now. For example, there's one Harvard professor, I forget his name right now, who's been writing about moral economies, and he says that the dominant model of capitalist model, which is about acquisition for the self, is actually not proven to be true anymore. That there's been a lot of experiments done in human psychology where they say that if you put people in difficult situations, will they only think about themselves or will they think of other people as well? And they are now showing actually people will think about other people. They're not naturally inclined to be selfish. You know, whereas if you look at the book by the selfish gene, for example, in that theory, for example, we are told we are naturally selfish. That means we should just continue to be selfish. But I think to put these other alternatives from the archives of religious discourses, we can point to different ways, both what is happening as well as what may be not sufficiently happening. So that's more or less where I'm going. Latif, it's a nice name you got there. Thanks very much for your questions. I mean, important questions. So, yeah, I think you had a few questions. Let me just try to pick up where you were going with that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you are saying that about how these different groups, whether Muhammadiyah or Nahdlatul Ulama, for example, can be characterized as capitalist versus feudal, for example. I think that's a critical comment, and maybe that's something that it's important for us to document, to see what is happening, because it does seem in many cases I would agree with that, not knowing the detail as such, that I wouldn't necessarily say that one shouldn't study the religious movements critically in order to see what is really going on. How much are they imbibing of capitalist values, and how much of the feudal practices that goes on? The only thing I would say is that one shouldn't use the regular models just simply to ignore what else they are doing as such. there is a tendency that once you for example, if I look at halal certification, right? I mean, just to use an example, it becomes very popular in South Africa. It is very popular. I see it is here as well, Malaysia. You know, so there's a lot of economics going on. A lot of it is basically creating a market for oneself, right? And so one should be free to do a analysis of creating a market to see how these kind of markets are closing up the possibility of other kinds of ethical practices. In Singapore, for example, one of Singapore is also very big in creating this, this certification. But there is one of the researchers was actually examining this topic itself, and his conclusion was, preliminary conclusion, I said, was to say that perhaps the certificate is making people too dependent on making an ethical decision. So rather than human beings deciding, whether one should, this is what one should eat or should not eat or should be participating, all you look for is a symbol, is that. So that transference as such is obviously an impact that you are having, for example, in the desire to create a market, in the desire to separate as such. So I'm hearing, even as I'm in Singapore, every time I'm hearing question, oh, MUIS is doing this. MUIS is a Majlisul Ulama. They are doing this, and I'm part of them for this time in Singapore. And they ask me, but what about this? What about this? So I think that there's a way to collect all of those, to be aware of these critical voices. That's why I was saying that religion is also about debate and awareness of these differences as well. But I would agree with you. I don't necessarily mean that we should not ignore these kind of broad practices as such. And I think there should be a critical element of the analysis, whether they are, what kind of economic practices are being followed in our Islamic religious institutions as well. So I think they are very relevant, but I feel that sometimes they are used in such a way that you don't pay any more attention to what else they are doing and what other kinds of values that are bringing as such. I feel there's always a kind of a dissatisfaction of in this kind of, even in Islamic economics. I had a student, for example, who was doing this in South Africa, and he interviewed a lot of the people who were doing the Sharia compliant practices, but he came out of there saying that people were not quite satisfied with what they were doing because they realized there's something not quite right in this. And I feel that that's the beginning of our moral analysis as such. Your second question is a bit much broader about all of these religious movements. Certainly, I think they are Wahhabism or the ISIS or these other religious groups as such. I think they are all, to a certain extent, they are part of the product of history. We should look at them. But I think we should start looking at them. I mean, there was a particular narrative, right, about, and there still is. I mean, you see how Israel is using the word terrorism. It's very clear about how it is using terrorism in order to silence any kind of questions, any kind of debates as such. And I think that the development of this radical movements in the last 20 years as such, even though I don't totally agree with some of the ethics that they ended up promoting in the public sphere, but I think one should also see them as part of the product of what has been going on, as some might call it, kind of the war over civilization that has been going on. It's a bit, it's unless there's something more specific, I would agree with you that they are modern, but I would also suggest that we should perhaps find another way of studying them than a kind of the model that was certainly promoted, by the West as such. Because remember, in the 1980s and until 1990s, the West saw the rise of Islamism as an alternative to communism as such, and it was useful as such. Mahmoud Mamdani's thesis of the good and the bad Muslim, and then it turned out to be against them. Now I feel that that's something that ethics or the study of ethics might actually provide a different way of analyzing them, rather than whether they are only a threat to the state, whether they are a threat to a society.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I realize that you have still many questions, but due to the time, I'm very sorry that we have to end our session. And we have already, experiencing the, the decolonizing, what is it, discourses or something like that.
Moment.
Yeah, decolonizing moment. But we have to end this session, and thank you very much, Professor Tayub, for the very interesting and engaging lecture. And we have to end this session. Please big applause for Professor Tayub. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, photo session right now. Okay. Okay, maybe we can first of all stand here.
Okay, yes, let's do that.
Dari sini. Yep.
Satu, dua, tiga. Baik.